Present.
Ben Vitale.
Present.
Chris Petras.
Present.
Paul Hickey.
Give him 20 minutes.
Eileen McDade Coleman.
She is here.
Keith Beckman.
Here.
Joe DeForest.
Present.
Charlie Ripley.
Present.
Joe Bennett is excused. Elaine Daly.
Here.
Timothy Lattimore.
Here. Mr.
Michael
Pinckney's
Didio?
here too.
Thank you. Michael Didio.
Here.
Ryan Foley.
Present.
Pat Allen.
Here. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silent prayer. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, I will turn this over to Fred in a second, but the purpose of this meeting tonight is for Dr. Benjamin to discuss alternate forms of local government and apportionment and redistricting, but I will let Fred do the introductions.
Thank you. So I'm here with Dr. Cheryl Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is presently the Associate Vice President for Regional Engagement and Director of the Benjamin Center at SUNY New Paltz. He has a PhD and a MA from Columbia, undergrad work at St. Lawrence. He's taught at any number of universities, Japan, China, Italy, the Rockefeller Institute. Dr. Benjamin was actually a county legislator from 1982 through 1983 in Western County, where he held the position.
1993.
Thank you. 1993.
I didn't lose the 1983 election.
You won that.
Yes.
So, Chairman, Chief Elected Officer, and Majority Leader as well. He's taught at the University of Wisconsin. He's presently working on the Ulster County Charter Revision Commission. Dr. DeFiore appointed him as the judicial task force, on the judicial task force of the New York State Constitution. He has written and published widely, so please bend your ear to listen to Dr. Benjamin. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's always my great pleasure to talk to a county legislature and about county government. That's what I spend thinking about and studying. Yeah, I know I'm supposed to stand here. You're taking me, right?
You can move around, just
So I
use the
can't
mic.
move around?
You can move around, just use the mic for the TV.
I can hold the mic.
Yep.
Because I'm not good at moving, I'm not good at standing still. Okay, so I have a lot of topics to talk about. You're interested in a lot of things, and I haven't got a lot of time. So I'm going to probably go pretty fast on these slides and pause now and then to make a point. If you have a question, stop me. I'm used to it. I've been teaching for 50 years, so I can probably manage your question. If I don't have answers, I'll get them. I promise to get back with answers. You have a record of the meeting, and we'll find out what I need to know. I need to convey that I don't know now. Okay, now the fundamental question before the county, I guess, or a fundamental question, is what form of government to have. The first thing to determine and decide or understand is there's no best form of government for the county. The form of government you choose is contingent on the goals of the government and its leaders, the nature of the community, the degree of conflict in the community, the kinds of conflict that exist, your objectives socially, economically, and so on. So my job isn't to tell you the best outcome. My job is to tell you the alternatives that you have before you. This presentation has 3 focal points: the legislative branch, the executive branch without a charter, and the executive branch with a charter. In discussing the legislative branch, I necessarily have to talk about a number of issues that face you, and there are a number of points that aren't in this presentation that might arise, but I will be talking about things like alternative structures for the legislature, how legislators are chosen, the size of the body, and so on. Regarding the executive, I'll be talking about the major alternatives that are available to you under state law and the alternatives that are available to you to the degree they're different under a charter system. And I'll be talking about what a charter system is. The first point to make to Americans is that county government, like most local governments in the United States, is not a separation of power system. It's a parliamentary system. Most people think of parliamentary systems as being foreign. But in fact, you know there are school boards that run schools. You know that there are village boards that run villages, town boards that run towns. The county board runs the county. And there's no elected executive in all those circumstances. There's an appointed executive, a manager sometimes, or a school superintendent sometimes. So we have actually a parliamentary system going in. We have under consideration, and we have an option of a separation of power system. New York State Constitution requires all local governments to have a legislative body elected by the people. Interestingly, it does not require them to have an elected executive. This confirms the point that we have a parliamentary style system, though we don't call it that. You have these slides. I'm leaving these slides with you, so you can make notes as you wish, but you don't have to worry about having access. We can have them posted to the website of the county. If the county's willing, I can post it to my website.
It'll be posted first thing in the morning.
Okay, so the initial choice is whether you want to operate under state law or home rule. You all operate under state law, as do most rural counties in New York. So you're structured according to options that are available in state law, and you operate in accord with state law. 34 counties operate under state law, so the county law and other commensurate statutes that have to do with the operation of the county. You have a home rule option in the New York Constitution, Article 9, the home rule provision adopted in 1963, which allows you to adopt a charter. And you can have forms of government different under a charter than you can have that are provided for under state law. You have additional options. And in fact, you can have provisions in your charter that preempt state law. Later I'm going to talk about a situation where you have legislative districts that are one person, one vote based. In that case, if you want to design those districts, you will have to do that at the county level. And if you do that at the county level, you could do it in accord with state law. You can do it commensurate with a provision of a charter that you might adopt that would separately define how you do that process. In Ulster County, we adopted a charter, and I had a hand in writing the provision. We just revised the provision. So there are models for redistricting under a charter in New York. First charters for counties are not very old. They date to the 1930s. Counties initially didn't have a charter option, as did cities. 23 counties operate under a charter now. So if you operate without a charter, you operate under a legislative system. This might be self-evident to you since you're operating the government. You're the people who are operating the government. Under a legislative system, you have two alternatives, a board of supervisors or a legislature. The key fact for the organization of legislatures in federal law is the one person, one vote decision of the Supreme Court in 1964, which said that every person has to be equally represented. That upset the apple cart for counties which had boards of supervisors because some towns were more populous than others, but in the board of supervisors, the towns were equally represented. So the counties had to figure out how to make those towns make one person, one vote work with a board of supervisors or adopt a legislature. Those were the two major alternatives that were chosen. 18 counties in 2017 had a legislature. York County had 20 legislature was adopted, and I think I have a historic slide. We'll go further. Equal protection requires equal representation in the districts, and this was applied to localities in 1968. So here's what happened in your county as far as I could tell. If I'm wrong, that's because you know better than I, not because because my research has been incomplete. So don't say it out loud, but after the meeting, come and tell me that I'm wrong. You know, when I was getting ready to be in the Army, I was taught how to teach. I don't know how many people were in the Army, but I was an officer in the U.S. Army in the 70s, and I was taught how to teach. The rules were tell Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. That was what we learned in teaching. The other rule we learned was never upset the major who was teaching the class. So don't embarrass me in front of everybody else, just tell me later, please. So weighted voting was adopted in the Board of Supervisors here in 1969. One member for each town, one member for each of 10 wards in the city of Auburn. 1970, there was an attempt to create a smaller legislature. Two efforts failed. In 71, a 21-member legislature was created. 12 members from towns, 9 from the city of Auburn with a weighted voting system. In 92, you reduced the number to 15. I understand you're interested in reducing the number again, and we can talk about that. Some people are, I'm not sure. I'm sure not everybody is. What's interesting about this county, and I think maybe unique, is that you have a legislature in weighted voting. Most places that have weighted voting, all that I know, have a board of supervisors. And the weighted voting system was adopted to allow the supervisors to remain a board of supervisors. But you switch to a legislature and retain the weighted voting system, which is unusual. I'm not certain it's unique, but if it's not, it's near unique. So you reduced the size of your legislature by 50% over the last half century. There's been a predisposition in New York State to reduce the size of legislatures. I hate being behind the podium. I can't connect with the audience.
You can pick up the mic and move around with it.
Then I can't. Will the clicker work if I go somewhere else?
There's a mobile clicker.
He's got it.
Yeah, this will work if I move around.
It's
Okay.
on the back there, so as long as you wait for it to-
All right. Now I can't see the slide. Okay. So the quotation from Federalist paper, everybody in here should read the Federalist Papers. And if you haven't read them, read them. It's the most important political philosophy ever invented in America. It's not as important as the Constitution, the most important system document, but the philosophy of the Federalist Papers is defining of our heritage. But anyway, unfortunately, I don't have the power to make the assignment and test you all to see if you did it. But you might want to take a look at, that might not be unfortunate for both of us. Madison said in Federalist 5, there's no objective way of deciding on the size of a legislature. So people will struggle over this back and forth a lot. There are really, in my opinion, two really important considerations. One is your capacity to have an effective committee system. If you have too few members, you can't have an effective committee system because you just can't cover the range of business. So you have to have enough members to have a committee system. Second, actually there are 3 points. Second is effective deliberation. Is the range of views in the communities being represented going to be at the table, and is the deliberation going to be full so you can arrive at accommodation of the range of views in the communities represented? And the third, of course, is the size of the group of people being represented. The smaller the body, the more people are represented by each representative. And at some point, the process of representation, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, gets a lot harder because there's a lot of people, a relatively large number of people to represent. So a congressman represents over 600, approaching 700,000 people in New York. And a member of the Assembly represents about 115,000. A member of the Senate, State Senate represents about 315,000. Those are a lot of people. More people than are in this county are represented by one state senator. So the representative paradigm that you have is an attractive one in that way because you have relatively small numbers of people, even in the biggest places, that are represented. Cost is an issue. Some of you may debate whether you're paying too many people, but and that's a consideration, but it has to be weighed against the values that you're serving: deliberation, capacity to have an effective committee system, and the representative function with the population. And weighted voting, of course, adds options because you can change the weights and increase the number of representatives by or decrease it by changing the weights. So that's an additional aspect of weighted voting. We'll talk more about that. Also, you can see that weighted voting allows flexibility in cities. You can change the number of representatives in cities with a weighted voting system to accommodate cities' larger populations. Legislature and weighted voting. Now, I have too many slides on this. So I'm going to go through some of them quickly. I urge you to stop me if I go. You know, I usually teach 50-minute increments, and I have each group for 28 times. Here I'm teaching at a longer. Hope that's not whiskey.
Yeah.
Looks good. In this case, I have the audience for one time at a longer period of time, and it's hard to sit. So if you stop me, then it'll be more interesting because you won't be just listening to one guy. See, somebody took the bait. Yes, sir.
It's good to hear that you're from St. Lawrence. I have a lot of relatives who went there. Very smart school.
Are they well-educated people?
But they're, well, they had a good drinking career up there. Our country.
You keep coming back to the same theme.
Well, your set of whiskey, I got it in my head. But anyways, I mean, the state of New York has lost a lot of congressional seats.
Right.
Because of our loss in population. Should we not downsize?
Well, I think that we've decided to, in the Congress you're talking about?
Well, I'm just saying that, you know, Congress is a good indicator as the
Congress is a
state of
fixed
New York
size
is
because
not
of
growing.
statute. The Congress is not a fixed size constitutionally. You can change the size of the House of Representatives. But, and there are bigger, there are some very big state legislators. One, New Hampshire, I think, has 400 members in one of its houses. So we can change this, but at the scale of the Congress is very large, and each congressman is very expensive. So I'm not sure I'd agree with changing the size of the Congress.
No, I'm saying that that's an indicator that we've lost population. And since we've lost population, we should reduce the size of our
Well, that presumes that presumes that you had the right arrangement to start out with. So it may be a reason to look at it, but it's not a reason to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
So we're familiar with weighted voting in corporations. People have different amounts of stock in companies, and they have different amounts of voting power. We're familiar with weighted voting in national politics. The Electoral College, which is much maligned recently, the Electoral College has a weighted voting system. More states have more votes than others. So weighted voting, although it seems unfamiliar to people, it seems suspicious, is familiar when you think about it, when you think about examples in life that we've noticed. Now, weighted voting is simply giving more strength in the body to one person than another for some reason or another. And the reason that happens is the one person, one vote principle. You can meet that requirement of the U.S. Supreme Court by weighting the votes. Talk a little bit more about how that's done very quickly. Go through this. So weighted voting allows the use of existing jurisdictional boundaries. So you have your towns and your city intact as units. Cities are represented by multiple people, but as units, you don't have overlapping boundaries. Those of you familiar with local government in New York know that we have overlapping non-contiguous boundaries in New York. Some villages are in two towns. Many towns are divided to be in different school districts. We even have a village in two counties. So when you have that, it's confusing to people, and government is less accountable to people. So this aspect of weighted voting is a very good aspect, that you have the same boundaries for your county government as you have for your other local governments. Yes, Mr. Petrus.
Thank you. Is there any that you're aware of, any existing rules that says that a town has to have a specific population in order to be split up by a legislature?
Yeah, there is. I'm going to come to that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So community, simplicity, accountability, no redistricting. Redistricting is contentious, can be partisan and divisive, and it also brings a cost. I'm going to say that we do it under consulting contracts all the time, so if you need to decide to do that, call me back. I have a guy who's in my office who does that. As I said, it may provide flexibility on the size of the body. It assures a close link between the county and towns. I have a friend named Peter Fairweather who does consulting in Western New York a lot, and he finds that in some places where you have boards of supervisors and weighted voting, there's a the town leaders, of course, are the same, so the town know what the county's doing, and the county knows what the town's doing. In Ulster County, where I worked in politics for 12 years, there was tension between the towns and the county, because the towns would often say, the legislators don't come down and talk to us in our meetings. We don't know what the county's doing. The county's doing stuff that we don't like, sales tax distribution, for example. So this is a strength. It might not be the overwhelming consideration, but the decision never should be made without knowing what the strengths of the alternatives are, in my opinion. Yes, sir. Can you say who you are?
Yeah, Andy Dennison.
Yes, sir.
Talking about the weighted voting, just kind of getting your opinion. Like during the federal elections, like the presidential elections, when you look at the electoral map,
Right.
like New York State, 80% of it is really red, but we're considered a blue state because most of our population is in one small area of New York State.
Right.
So is that really a good thing for weighted
It's
voting?
not necessary. Under law, you could have an electoral vote specified to each congressional district and have the 2 electoral votes that are statewide specified to the state. There's no requirement to do that. The reason that the states do that is it increases their clout in presidential selection. So New York's number of electoral votes is an important number for presidential candidates. It turns out that New York is less competitive now than it used to be. There was a time where New York was a very competitive state between the parties. So this would bring a lot of attention to New York and consideration of New York in presidential elections. Now that one party dominates, that party kind of assumes that New York will support it, and so that's less important. But the practice of concentrating, giving the plurality winner for the president all the electoral votes from a state is a statutory matter that can be changed at the state level. So you could have red and blue electors in the same election.
Dr. Benjamin, and if I recall correctly, every state's different. Every state sets their own.
Every state, but it's predominant, the aggregation of the votes of the state and casting for one person is the predominant system. I think Maine has an alternative system, but I didn't come here to talk about that, so. And I'm not here to misinform you.
No, I was just curious on the whole weighted voting thing.
Disadvantages of weighted voting. It's complex. You have to hire a consultant to tell you how much power in different circumstances each member has. It's counterintuitive. People don't quite get that all these people in the room don't have the same strength in affecting the outcome. So 8 don't win and 7 don't lose. It depends on which 8, which 7, and so on. It takes no account of the many dimensions of representation. This is a very serious criticism. In committees, you don't have weighted voting. So you can have significant decision-making in committees and weighted voting brought to the floor. You don't have weights for representing people in the district. So one person can have 10,000 constituents, another can have 5,000 constituents for the same amount of resources available, different amount of resources available to each constituent depending on the population of the geographic territory. This is a misspelling. It's not unite domination, it's unit domination. In some places, you divide up a unit like the city here could be divided up, and yet all the members could decide to vote together, and they could have greater strength collectively than anticipated by the weighted voting scheme. That's called unit domination by statisticians. And doesn't work in committees, and some people think it overvalues parochialism. This is more with a Board of Supervisors system, because the supervisor is primarily the supervisor and only secondarily governing the county. There are exceptions to that. It's not universally true, but it's a predisposition. Montgomery County is the most recent county to adopt a charter. I have 2 quotes. This first is from the head of the legislature. A certain group of supervisors who, when they voted together, controlled everything. So they went away from the Board of Supervisors system. And the executive, who presumably is happy that there's an executive. Board of Supervisors and a part-time administrator contributed to this dysfunction and parochial fighting along town lines. So they rejected the weighted voting system, adopted a charter, adopted a legislature and a separately elected executive, and they give this rationale. That's my attempt at humor. If you don't like it, you're not going to see anything else funny, so you're not going to. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure this is an appropriate question to ask you, but you said it was unusual when the county went from a board of supervisors to a legislative body to keep the weighted voting unusual.
Yes.
Do you have, could you guess why they would have done that? Is there underlying reasons why someone would decide?
I haven't researched it deeply enough, but it's usually some political reason for it.
In terms of party power
Or getting it through. Remember, you had 3 attempts, so they were probably I would suspect that there were negotiations. If we do it, what do we have to do to get it passed? But I thought you said I don't think this is appropriate. I thought you were going to ask me how old I was.
Oh, no, never.
45.
Yeah. But generally, it's party driven.
See me after the talk, I'll buy you an ice cream.
Because if they had decided to do it a different way, they would have created a legislature and then,
They could have done one person, one vote, but I think it probably would have been, I think that it looked, I'm speculating, but it looks to me like the size of the body was the issue, not the, and the trade-off was to keep weighted voting to get the size of the body to that level. There are 2 standards that are in the law, and this is very interesting. Some people think that weighted voting is unconstitutional. Some people think it's undesirable. That's one question. Some think it's unconstitutional. Clearly, there are a lot of judges that don't like it. Federal judges don't like it. Clearly, there's some indication in the law that challenging it might be a ripe time to challenge it. But there's no U.S. Supreme Court decision that calls weighted voting unconstitutional, as we'll briefly go through. So the federal government doesn't like social science. You're supposed to say boo. They don't. So the weighted voting on the BANZEF, you may be familiar from the papers that have been prepared for you. The BANZEF method is a statistical method, and the federal courts don't like that. Recently, we had litigation on redistricting in the Supreme Court, and Judge Roberts made disparaging remarks about sociologists and political scientists from the bench. So professors from all over the country wrote to the Supreme Court explaining that a person educated at Harvard should be smarter than that. But the federal courts like one person, one vote. The Court of Appeals has embraced the BANZEF index as an acceptable alternative. The High New York Court as an acceptable alternative to meeting the one person, one vote requirement. Weighted voting has been overturned in some jurisdictions because of the relative size of the units, relative weighting power of the units was extremely different. But it has not been determined to be unconstitutional. There are judges that have opined that it should be unconstitutional, as you've seen. Iannucci's the great voting power case. That was an Nassau County case.
Dr. Benjamin,
Pardon me?
in those court cases where they analyzed the disparity of weighted votes, what was that range that was found to be unacceptable?
Well, the key case was in Rockland County, and it wasn't really a weighted voting case. It was a system where they took their smallest jurisdiction and gave it one legislator. And then they took every other jurisdiction, observing town lines, and gave them multiple legislators relative to the first place. So it was kind of using multi-member districts as an alternative to weighting. And the trouble was that Rockland County grew very rapidly. It's in the lower Hudson Valley. And so they had to keep adding legislators to the towns to make it work. And they still had a disparity approaching 90% difference between the biggest and smallest place. So the courts ultimately rejected it. The courts also rejected in '93 the Nassau County system with a relatively large disparity. I don't recall the number, but I can get that.
Thank you.
So may I ask then, was 90% was considered too much
In
in profit.
Yeah.
And we've got 100%.
Well, you've got one place that has twice the voting power as another
Right.
place. I'm not sure that would be dispositive. I'd have to look at the facts of that, okay?
Thanks.
Because there's a contingency having to do with the number of jurisdictions. The whole thing turns on your capacity at the margin to influence the outcome of a vote. It's the percentage of time you can influence the outcome of a vote. So I have to look at, it's more than just the different sizes. Now, essentially, this illustrates that in Nassau County, 3 places dominated under one person, one vote, so they had to do the Banzhaf process. The right hand is Banzhaf, that distributes power among the members, among the towns. The left hand is just population-based allocation of proportions. And the court favored the Banzhaf option. Now, this is a case I actually worked on. I was on the staff of the New York City Charter Commission in 86, 87, 88. Anybody from New York City here? It's not a popular
No.
credential in upstate New York. Well, we had a board of estimate in New York City. Actually, I was living in Newport, but the city had a board of estimate, which had a scheme where every borough, there were 5 boroughs, every borough had a borough president had 1 vote, and every citywide elected official had 2 votes. There were 3 citywide elected officials, so there were 11 votes, and the citywides could outvote the boroughs, except the boroughs in coalition with one of the citywides could outvote the citywides, other citywides, including the mayor. And this system was overturned because Brooklyn had about 1.8 million people and Staten Island had about 300,000 people, and they were equally represented in the Board of Estimate. And there was an attempt to rescue this by using weighted voting, but we never adopted a weighted voting system. This is important for you because if you're going to get into litigation, the Supreme Court has never undone a weighted voting system. It has opined against weighted voting, and here's its opinion from Justice White. The Reynolds versus Sims cases may be imperfect. That's one person, one vote. But it does assure legislators will be elected by and represented citizens in districts of substantially equal size. It does not attempt to inquire whether, in terms of how the legislature actually works, the districts have equal power. So he's directly addressing power equalizing. He's rejecting the idea. But it's not germane to the outcome because there wasn't a weighted voting scheme to overturn. It was his opinion about the potential for saving the Board of Estimate through weighted voting. If you're thinking of doing this, don't do it because it's a problem. So we call that dicta in the law. I'm not a lawyer, but we call that dicta. It's an opinion that's not necessary to decide the case. This is Judge Spade, who doesn't like weighted voting, and this case came up in Nassau County in the wake of the New York City case. We wrote a new charter, which is still in place, something we're very proud, some of us are very proud of for the city. It was put in place in '89. Now there are 2 charter commissions in the city working to change that charter, and I have no involvement with that, but I'm rooting against them because they're messing with my charter. This has absolutely no consequence for anybody that I'm against them. The Supreme Court firmly rejected weighted voting. It is not true that they rejected a weighted voting scheme. They expressed unhappiness with the potential of weighted voting for the Board of Estimate. He calls it a mathematical quagmire, antecedent to Judge Roberts, who said something similar just a few months ago. Fails to take effect other critical factors relating to the actual daily operations of the governing body. No, the Supreme Court took the opportunity to express, not only to express a preference, but a directive. I would disagree with the judge, but it's in the law, and that's a federal district court decision. So we have a number of cases from the state courts supporting weighted voting outcomes, and we have some suggestion in the federal courts that there's a constitutional imperfection in weighted voting. So I came here to tell you that there's no clear path. You could get attorneys who might think there's a clear path and get them to come, but that's what I think.
This is an Eastern District case. Did this go up to the Second Circuit?
It wasn't taken on appeal by the county. The county accepted the outcome.
So it would be persuasive but not binding here.
Right. So the county, the reason on this case, we don't have a more definitive outcome is because the county accepted the outcome. The county government decided to go with the legislature rather than defend weighted voting. Yes, sir.
But when you're dealing with taxpayers' money, and I've sat on this board for a number of years, and we have passed, the minority has passed the budget, and, you know, that's why I really don't feel that unless the majority votes to pass a budget, that budget is actually legitimized.
Well, as Bill Clinton would say, it's a matter of definition.
Bill Clinton. Boy, that's a good one.
That's as far as I'm going to go on that.
Completely different subject.
What constitutes a majority? A majority of the voting power or a majority of the people?
I always thought the people were in charge, but
Well, people have to count equally. That's the crucial point. Once they count equally, the majority of them are in charge. This is a philosophic question. We can go down that road and not look at the rest of the slides, which I'm perfectly happy to do. Let's come back to it, as I always say in class. Are there any teachers in here? Do you ever say that? Let's go back to it. It's one of the 10 most famous statements by teachers. Where's your homework? Let's come back to it. Stop chewing that gum. Okay, now. Let me go back a minute. I'm going to go back. Okay, I think the slide I'm looking for is forward. So you have alternatives to weighted voting, and you're thinking about, I'm informed by the council that you're thinking about one person, one vote, single-member districts. There are a lot of alternatives, but some of them are a little remote and arcane. We talked about multi-member districts as one alternative. It's a different way of doing weighting when you think about it. In Ulster County, when I was first elected, we had multi-member districts to assure relative equality, and the courts have accepted that. You can do proportional representation systems. I'm not advocating them. I'm just saying that when you make choices and you think there's only two alternatives because of familiarity, you could be making a mistake. And some places in New York have done very interesting things in their elections. Portchester, for example, the town of Portchester, has a single transferable votes scheme. I won't describe that, but no counties have done that. So why would you pick an alternative? Familiarity and comfort. It seems logical, as it was clear from the question, that that single-member districts is the way we do it in America. And it's not a perfect system by any means. It wastes a lot of voting power from a theoretical point of view, but it's familiar. Equal formal strength in the legislature and resources for a range of representative tasks. So everybody is equally strong and equally available for the range of tasks. Overlapping jurisdictional boundaries. When you do single-member districts, you're going to have overlapping boundaries, and the question came, can you divide towns? And we'll come to that in a minute. Redistricting and gerrymandering, very serious. This is a national issue. If you go to one single-member districts, you're going to have to redistrict. If you're going to have to redistrict, you're going to have to find ways to deal with the potential of partisan bias in districting, which we think we have done in Ulster County, but you'll have to do that. 4-year terms and single-member districts. You have 4-year terms, you have term limitation, and you have single-member districts. 4-year terms and single-member districts are complex. You think there's a lot of slides, but I left those out. But all you have to do is think about this. Is 10 divisible by 4? Now, if you say yes, we have to talk. With equal outcomes, because you're going to have to redistrict every 10 years, but you have 4-year terms, so obviously you're going to have problem and staggering, and you're going to have problems with what districts people run in at what times. And I can demonstrate this with lots of slides, but does everybody sort of get the picture? If you, right now, you don't have to worry about redistricting, so you don't have to worry about staggering, overlapping the time where you have to redistrict, and how that affects some people running in a district that was up 2 years before the redistricting, some people running in a district that's up 2 years after the redistricting. It's, or 3 years after the redistricting, it's a problem.
Dr. Benjamin, isn't a simple solution to that to have everyone run like the Congress at the 104th?
Yes, you could, there are two solutions. One, you can employ intermittent 2-year terms to get everybody lined up for the redistricting year. Or you can have simultaneous elections. Then you have to have the debate over the value of simultaneous elections. The value of, the alleged value, the argued value of staggering is continuity. As a practical matter, incumbents are reelected a lot and there's a good deal of continuity. But as a theoretical matter, you could take the whole legislature out in 1 year. That actually happened in a town that I was advising on adopting a award system instead of at-large voting system in the Hudson Valley. The whole legislature went out in 1 year after that occurred. Well, it's 5 people, it wasn't 15 people, but that created a certain serious lack of continuity and experience in the board. So that's a whole debate to have, whether you want to have staggering or not, term limitation or
A
not.
quick question regarding that, you said they were.
I'm not prepared with all those slides here. You
Those
understand?
sorry, with that 5-member, that was a county legislature?
No, that was a town board.
Okay, sorry. I was gonna say, how big are the districts?
One person, one vote. Voting Rights Act. Now I understand what's the proportion of the population in the county that's Caucasian? It's a high percentage, right? So you probably don't have a Voting Rights Act challenge in this county, which assures that minority people are effectively represented. How do you do redistricting? In charter counties, you specify it in your charter. In non-charter counties, you do it in accord with state law. Now remember, there are federal standards. So one person, one vote is a federal standard. For your purposes, that means that the range of difference in population in a district needs to be plus or minus 5%. The Supreme Court allows a range of difference in population much greater for localities than for state government or federal government. State and federal government has the virtual numerical equalities required for districts. Localities have a range of difference that they can take up. So the federal standards come first, and if the state requirements are not compliant, if the federal standards require non-compliance with state law, that justifies non-compliance, right? There's a lot of conflict in law and local government law. I don't know if your attorneys would confirm this or not, but local government law is adopted over a long period of time, and you can find provisions that seem to take you in different directions. And there's a good deal of conflict in between state law and federal law that was adopted after the state law was adopted or established by the Supreme Court. So districting must be based on population. Federal law requires the basis of districting to be population, notwithstanding that New York state law provides the term population only residents, citizens, or registered voters. That's not the basis of representation. The basis is population because federal law requires it. So there's a conflict in law, and the federal law prevails. Now we have the national census. New York State has to use the census in redistricting. The census may not be available in the decennial year. It's usually available in the year ending in 1. So the process really, in local government, it really plays out for the year ending in 3. You do it, and then you affect it in the year ending in 3 because you sometimes don't have the data. The data is released non-simultaneously. So some states have it before others. So sometimes you can't get it done in the year ending. I wrote a law for Ulster County saying you had to do it in the year ending in 1 and created a great uproar because we had the data only for about 6 weeks. We did it, but we changed the law after that. Standards and criteria in New York law. So substantially equal weight for the population. Divide no town except if 110% of a full ratio, if their population is 110% of a full ratio. So there's the point that you say about state law. If the mean is, if the mean population is 5,000 and the town's population is below 5,500, the state law says it shouldn't be divided in redistricting. If it's above 5,500, it could be divided. But if the federal law requires the division, this federal law can overtake the state law. So that gets you into a tangle sometimes. Substantially fair and effective representation of the people in the local government is organized in political parties. So there's a vague state provision that you shouldn't gerrymander. I say gerrymander because that was the guy's name in the 19th century. That's one reason. The second reason is that my name's Jerry. And it's not named after me. Districts are convenient and contiguous territories. So these values are hierarchical. The law directs they be considered in order. It's very important that they're hierarchical because different outcomes occur depending on which values you take first, second, and third. So we can talk more about that, further down the road. President. Who will do the redistricting? Are you going to have a commission do it, or are you going to have a committee do it, or the county legislature, subject to the action of the legislature? Are you going to have your own staff? Staff in county governments don't like doing this because they end up on a side. And most professional staff don't want the Republicans or the Democrats mad at them. They want everybody liking them. Right? So if you require your GIS person to do the maps, they're not going to be happy. So you need to hire a consultant. You need, one thing people say about me is they can't tell when I'm kidding around. That was, so sometimes I have to say, that was a joke. So you can add local values to the list. So you have the state value, you have the national value, equal in population, subject to the Supreme Court's interpretation. Protected minorities' right to effective representation has to be considered. Then you have the state values. Then you can add local values. What might they be? Preserving communities of interest. Sometimes there are communities, ethnic, racial, cultural communities that might be divided in a redistricting that we prefer not to divide. We want them in one district. We want them in one district. Long established neighborhood boundaries. Very important when we did Oneonta. There were certain neighborhoods they didn't want to divide when we did their city redistricting for Oneonta. Taking account of administrative needs of the Board of Elections. The board, when you district, the Board of Elections capacity to run the election gets affected, and they might want you to consider how they've designed their districts, where people vote, where people are accustomed to voting so that they don't miss voting because they go to the wrong place, and those kinds of administrative considerations. New subject. Anybody want to go to the bathroom or leave? How do you feel when, what do you teach?
Oh, I don't anymore.
What did you teach?
Mostly management.
In college?
Yeah.
How did you feel when a student would get up in the middle of class and leave?
No student ever did that to me. I would know.
Wow.
Only at the ledge.
Well, I guess I was one up there. Counties operating under state law with legislative systems.
They just didn't show up in class.
There are 5 options for the executive. The legislative chair elected by his or her peers acts as an administrator. The legislature appoints an administrator. The legislature appoints a director. The legislature appoints a manager. The people elect a president. The last one is designed to accommodate Nassau County, which had an office called president as their first elected executive. So you can see that the Board of Supervisors may appoint the chair of the Board of Supervisors, county administrator, who shall perform the duties of the county administrator concurrently with the those of chairman, but without additional compensation. He or she may serve as head of a department, not administered by an elected official. And then there's a curious provision that the chair appoints the purchasing agent. That is, it's not subject to the board's approval. Administrator is executive, appointed by the Board of Supervisors to serve during a term of office for which the members are chosen. Vacancies are filled by appointment. County manager. The manager has more powers than the administrator. The manager usually has required to prepare a budget and has appointing authority sometimes subject to legislative approval, sometimes not. County director. In other words, there's a range of options where the executive is either appointed or a member of the board, and the powers are differently distributed based on state law. So the state law says, here's what the person can do, and here's what the legislature can do regarding the executive.
Dr. Benjamin?
Yes.
In these examples here, your supervisors, Board of Supervisors and Board of Legislature are interchangeable?
Yeah, because the term of the Board of Supervisors in the law is a term of art. It means legislature.
Okay, thank you.
And legislature means Board of Supervisors,
Thank you.
by definition. So there's even a provision for elected executive in state law. Some people think you have to have a charter to have an elected executive, but that's not true. We do have a provision for elected executive in state law. No county uses it. And then the duties are defined in state law. So the chief executive is the chief administrator, the budget officer, reports on the condition of the government, and so on. These are conventional executive powers. And then there are powers that may be delegated. So you see that it's like what happened was that county government developed, and the state, instead of doing charters in the turn of the 19th century, said we're going to provide for alternative ways of organizing county executive function and put it in state law and let the county choose one of those. So that was before, it was in time before charters became an option, which occurred in the 1930s in Westchester and Mass. And you are effectively operating under, I think, am I right? You're operating under state law.
Yeah.
Under one of these provisions. Now you can't see this, so I have the upper hand. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Presiding officer is part-time, has limited legal authority, but is elected. That's a source of legitimacy. The appointed administrator has limited legal authority, serves for the term of the legislature, and is professional manager. The appointed manager is power to hire and fire, serves at the board's pleasure, and is a professional manager. The director has a fixed term, the president has a veto power and 4-year terms. So those are the basic differences. I can't go into detail on all of these, but think about, in general, the formal powers of each is specified in state law. The degree of security and appointing power and independence from the legislative branch differ. State law may be augmented by local law, on removal, for example. And there's a whole question of informal power. If you have a politician who's elected in the community or elected by his or her peers, that person has the legitimacy of election. If you have a person who's a manager, they have the legitimacy of expertise, but they're not rooted in the community. So you have, and also the managerial career takes them from place to place as they try to improve themselves professionally. Whereas the elected executive is, and we'll see in the charter, is rooted in the local community and is based there. It's not, they might change elected jobs or leave the position, but they're not attracted to another community to be a manager in a bigger place with higher pay. I'll go more into this.
Is there a provision under the state form for a 2/3 override?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge?
So I'll have to look at it. That fund, I don't know about a lot about that option, but it's not used. But I can check. This is a chart I made. What places which legislators are predisposed towards appointed administrators or appointed managers. places with boards of supervisors are predisposed towards presiding officers having the executive function or appointed administrators. Administrators are generally less empowered than managers, so there's a distinction in law that establishes that. These are not interchangeable terms. That's a normal button. So you have the board of directors, you hire somebody, they run the county, you hold them accountable for performance. You've got somebody doing that now. Are you a manager or an administrator?
Administrator.
All right. So this is a model, corporate model, comes from the early 20th century progressive period. It presumes that government is like a business, and the board of directors is board of legislators, not the executive function. This is restatement of the previous points. Larger print. So you have a charter. First, look at the map. I didn't use red and blue because I know this is a closely divided body. And I want to go home tomorrow with the same number of limbs as I arrived. But I did use green to show you where the county the charter systems are in place. You can see it's downstate where the more populous places are located, but there's a tendency to go to a elected executive increasingly as you come through western New York, because simply because the size of the undertaking is big. The budgets are substantial, the tasks are big, and it's challenging for a part-time person to manage. Sometimes you get a chairman of a legislature who's a retired person who is independently wealthy or runs their own business and has lots of discretion on the allocation of their time. So that limits the number of people who can actually serve, and when they serve, can actually devote their time to the work.
Dr. Benjamin, last time I checked on that map, there were 5 of those counties with charters that had either an administrator or a manager.
But we have.
If you look back to that map.
Okay, let me see if I have that. Counties with elected executives, according to my count, are, with charters and elected executives are 18.
Yeah, and 5 with an appointed.
So
either
there
manager
are,
or-
so there are more charters than 23.
No, that's right. That's what I said. There's 5 with either a manager or administrator and a charter. And that's right.
Yeah, so I'm right.
Yep.
Thank you.
That was 2 slides ahead. Sorry about that.
Now, looks complicated, but it's not. The top row is the voters pick the legislature and the executive runs the departments. Subject to advice, usually subject to advice and consent with an override, usually extraordinary majority, sometimes 2/3, sometimes 60%. Depends on the body, depends on the charter. We're familiar with this, right? We know what this is all about. Well, full disclosure, I wrote the Ulster County Charter, wrote an elected executive, convinced the entire charter commission it was a good idea, put in place an elected executive system. We went through the national economic crisis with an elected executive. He did an extraordinary job, but it looks like he's going to stay in the job for his life. And this gave me pause about not having a term limitation provision. And he dominates the government, and the legislators have a hard time figuring out how to get leverage in that government. I told them that they don't know how, they can, but they don't know how, or they're unwilling to. The fundamental challenge for them is to work across party lines to make sure their institution is consequential. But that is a challenge when you adopt an elected executive. The legislature has to understand how to behave as an effective body, and that it has institutional interests. It's not just Democrats against Republicans, and it's not the old game. It's a new game with new rules. And sometimes it requires actually the membership change substantially until the legislature becomes effective. It's just my experience, not in a few places, but I think it's a valuable experience. Yes?
Isn't that the paradigm for executive versus legislative from state through federal? If the legislature acquiesces its power, then the executive is.
Well, it's really a function of the people. I mean, I know Mark Molinaro pretty well. He's running for governor now. He's extremely effective with the legislature, but he's not dominant. He's collaborative. There's a collaborative style. And I know other executives who brook no difference. You know, they're confrontational. So partly it's structural, and partly it's, you can't do everything through structure. Partly it's how people are operating the system. Some of the most famous or effective county executives, elected county executives in New York. I was talking about John Klein. Some of you might have heard of him. He was county executive in Suffolk County, the first one. He was a very strong person, but he was a collaborative with the legislature, and that's a very competitive, partisan divided body. And they managed to work well together. So it's partly, but what I'm saying is the legislature has to think of itself as a legislature, not think of itself as a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans. Or else the executive doesn't have to give consideration to the institution. He or she has to give consideration to constructing majorities out of the members, which is a different thing. This is a link to the charter. I'll spare you that. Elected executive strengths and weaknesses. Local, I told you that. As a political coalition, this is very important in a diverse community. People have to believe they have to understand and believe that they have a say with the person in charge. It's remarkable to me. When I was head of the government for 2 years. People would come to the county and say, "Who's in charge of the county?" They wanted a deal. Say a business wanted to locate. Who's in charge? You couldn't explain to them that it was a legislative system. You had to be the person in charge because they weren't satisfied. So the idea of an elected executive is presumptively in charge because he or she's elected by the whole county. They've authored a program so they can claim support for what they want to do. They're known and networked in the state local system. This is very important. We have a partisan state. We have people who run for state office who are in a party. And when you go to Democrat or Republican events here in the county, you'll find other partisans who you interact with from other towns, from the state legislature, and so on. So this is a network that has consequence for your county connecting with Albany. The county executives in New York State actually have an association. And the governor regards them as a constituency because he's an executive. So that's a dimension of elected executives that managers don't have, because they're not in the, if they enter the partisan network, they do that at their peril because the partisan control can shift.
It's against our code of ethics.
Thank you for that reminder. It's very important. It's important that you have somebody who knows there's a code of ethics. Not every county has that. I'm not kidding. It's a good for political career ladder and community. As you know, if you're an ambitious politician, I don't know if anybody here is ambitious at this higher, but if you're ambitious, there aren't a lot of ways to advance in New York. You can go to the state legislature, you can go to a countywide office. So if you have what we call a political ladder, you attract more people to opportunity in politics. A lot of people don't think about that. Of course, if one person gets on there long in the ladder and doesn't move for 30 years, that's a problem. With the political ladder idea. The executive may be untrained and untested, has partisan adversaries from the outset. Might be hard for them to be consensual because they campaign against the other side in elections. Concentrates power a lot. Tend to think short term because of re-election being a constant consideration. Becomes entrenched. The convergence between the public interest and the personal interest may not be perfect. People might be doing some things to advance themselves rather than thinking about broader public interest. So out of curiosity, I figured the number of terms that current members have been in, current sitting executives, and you can see that there are 5 who've been in 3 or more terms, 9 who've been in 2 terms. The turnover is less than you think. That's what I'm trying to say. But you have a term limitation. You can deal with that with term limitation because it's almost considered. Appoint executive strengths. Hired with specific credentials, avoids concentrated political power, professionally trained, and experienced in management. Longer-term thinking is an inclination toward longer-term thinking, planning over time, rather than the next budget, the next election. Network regionally and nationally, professionally, not politically, but professionally. We say they're best in more consensual environments where the community has a degree of consensus about what it wants to do, where it's less conflictual. And the base can be informal, but very important. If a person's in a place long enough and they join, we were talking about this, I had this marginally good hamburger across the street for supper, and I was talking to the county attorney, and the appointed executives can actually establish themselves in the community and become strong because they're valued across the community in volunteer organizations and social networks in the community. So that's an important opportunity for them. Weaknesses: no political base. Security dependent on persistence of legislative support. And this is why the removal clause in your charter, if you have a charter, is very important. I had to help rewrite the charter of Newburgh because the turnover was too great and the managers couldn't get purchase on the problem. The city's very troubled. So we made it harder. We created a supermajority to take the person out.
And now he's there as a holdover because they didn't have enough votes to fire him. They didn't have enough votes to.
He finally got reappointed. And you know what? Now they're complaining that they can't get rid of the manager. Before they were complaining to me that they.
I did some work with Mike.
But you know, stability has value. You're not going to have continuity in your legislative bodies. You're going to limit terms and diminish continuity. Then you want stability in your managerial operation. No, not rooted in a national profession. And there's also a predisposition to bypass the person by the elected officials who want to deal directly with the departments and agencies, which is a constant challenge in systems of professional administration. So here are some of the issues. One really bad thing that happens with professional managers is that politicians take responsibility for their successes. Now this is natural, right? If you're in an elected office, you say, well, I'm elected, I gotta go out and talk to the people. You know, if we found more deadbeat parents and got them to pay to support their kids, I should take credit for it because I'm chairman of the committee on public assistance. It's very important to share credit with the professional managers because it undermines their morale if their credit isn't shared. And that happens a lot. I've seen that a lot. And it's a sign, I'm lecturing you now, but it's a sign of weakness in the politicians. Competent people like being surrounded with effective others and acknowledging them. That's my lecture. I'll stop. Yes, sir.
That can also be the other way too, Ken.
Yeah, there has to be a mutuality. Absolutely. But my observed experience is that it's more of a problem in one direction than another.
I'm more than happy for you guys to take all the credit.
That's a good approach. I don't have much seniority here.
Don't forget all the credit.
That's how I'm going to get it, though, Doctor.
So the effectiveness of the executive leadership support, partisan environment, decision-making style of the legislature, and the formal powers of the charter. There are factors that affect the relative. So you have to think about when you're defining the job. In Poughkeepsie, we define the manager's job in terms of credentials and experience. And what we thought about was, you know, what sort of formal credentials that you need in a job, but you also have to think about the systemic questions that make the person, that potentially add to success or diminish success. The elected executive, it could be co-opted. Generally speaking, the executive gets to be full-time, the legislature part-time, so that diminishes the legislature relative to the executive. Legislature lose access to key people. I find that legislatures don't stick together, they quarrel too much, and that diminishes the institution. Boy, I didn't come here to criticize you for what I'm doing. You know, a lot of times I get questions and I don't know where they're coming from. People say, don't you think that? They say, uh-oh, somebody's on one side and somebody's on the other. So be careful, I gotta be careful. Poorly understood legislative role after transition and unfamiliarity with optimizing legislative powers. I'm a big believer in, for example, in public hearings. I don't think that county legislators do enough with their formal oversight responsibilities. They pay attention to budgets significantly, but they don't come back and say, how did you spend the money in the last 6 months? They don't establish goals sufficiently with the executive and say to the executive, are you going to build 100 widgets? And the executive says, yes, I'm going to build 100 widgets. And then 6 months later, come back and say, how many widgets have you built so far? And that is important and makes the legislature strong, but it's because it's part-time, because there's not sufficient staff, and the separation of power system, it often doesn't happen. Other considerations in adopting alternative kinds of systems. There are other countywide offices that are judicial, you can't touch them in a charter. They're constitutionally based. I created, I take personal responsibility for this, the Office of Controller in Ulster County, figuring that we'd have an internal oversight of the executive that was full-time, just like the state is supposed to have, with some success. And what happened was that the executive just didn't use the budget to diminish the capacity of the controller to do his job. So when you design the institutions, you have to be mindful of the way they're actually going to work, not just what they're theoretically there to do. And that was a problem. I said in the committee where we were doing the transition, I was on the committee, I said, the controller will save money and be able to claim that money for more staff. But that didn't work. And that's it, amazingly enough, in an hour and 15 minutes. Probably I didn't communicate well enough because I didn't take enough. This gentleman.
You were talking earlier about the town lines and dividing towns, stuff like that. I mean, obviously, other than right here in Auburn, we're a very long rural county.
Very
And
beautiful. I drove through not much of the Sunday.
Well,
very beautiful.
our towns tend to be tight-knit, territorial, however you'd like to put it.
All towns.
So if you split a town in half or a quarter of a town off, that's probably not going to set well with the towns. I guess what I'm getting at is what say in the matter do the towns have?
Well, you're right here. The decision is in this body. Look, we have a local government system in New York that wasn't this. I call it. I say, you know, the idea of intelligent design, which is the proof of God. You know, somebody had to make this. That's the argument for the proof of God. Well, there's no argument of intelligent design for local government in New York. It's the result of an historic evolution.
Trial and error.
You know, and I've written a lot about this. So it's not just the rural towns that are very, very jealous of their integrity. The suburban towns in Long Island, the villages in Long Island, in Nassau County, Westchester. We're doing a study now at the Rockefeller Institute in Westchester. And not only are they jealous, but they have fundamentally different priorities. Some places are on Long Island Sound. Some places are on the Hudson River. Some places are inland. Some are very rural, some are very densely populated. So that's the virtue of the supervisors, of Board of Supervisors or Board of Legislators, that you can get away, presuming you can defend it legally in this ambiguous environment. You can keep from adding to the, what I call, non-coterminality of boundaries, which, how many people live in a school district that has parts of towns in it?
All of us.
People are extremely confused by that, and they also feel that they're not fairly taxed, even though we do equalization and so on. So it's a serious concern. I'm going on too long, but I think what I'm trying to tell you is that this is about balancing equities. What do we get, what do we give? It's not about perfection or getting 100% in terms of values or objectives. Yes? Gentleman in the back, and then orange shirt next, because I'm not a fan of Syracuse.
I've been around for a little bit, and I've been in different governmental bodies. I come from a mayor, council, strong manager, form of government, and the informational flow was a lot better to the full body versus a committee form. And secondarily, at the county level, I mean, I've seen other counties that have county executives, like Onondaga County has Joni Mahoney over there, and she gets a lot of response from the governor, from the state. She backed him early on, but I'm just saying,
Cross-party line.
yeah,
Yeah, so
But-
that was especially important.
yeah. And with economic development, I'd like to be able to I know that the projects that I've been around over the number of years, you know, the people who are investing, you know, $50 million or $100 million, they want to talk to the boss.
Right.
They don't want to talk to somebody who's,
We agree on those things. We agree that people are looking for an empowered chief executive. And Syracuse and Onondaga County is a big and diverse county. So its values, essentially conflict is resolved in supporting the executive. You know, they vote, people from different groups vote for that person, and they have a stake in that person. So, but you're giving way. You can get an incompetent person.
right? And also,
So again, it's a question of balance. Now, regarding your first point, that's really interesting. Your first point is extremely interesting. There are many counties in the United States that have boards of 3 to 5 people. And they run as essentially a governing committee or a legislative committee. They might have an executive, may not. They might have a presiding judge, for example, in the South. They call them judges. And you can choose a legislative body that is essentially a committee of the whole. That's within your range of choice. I think there's one county that has a board of 7, or 9. I put that up on there. I don't remember.
Orleans.
So you can choose that, but you're giving way on the committee system idea, which we say divides the work and allows specialization in the members.
and one other thing, with the other governmental body that I was with, we had a check and balance system with the manager in regards that we had to pass the claims list every week. And I thought that was a good way to slow down the manager or.
Well, you know, when you get into the guts of it, you can do a lot in a charter or in local law in support of implementation of a charter that addresses your concerns. So when I worked on the Westchester County Charter, which a lot of the proposals weren't adopted, so I don't want to claim enormous success, but when I worked on that charter, there was great concern about the timing of the budgetary process. You know, the legislature didn't get the budget timely. There wasn't enough time for proper review. So you can do that in the charter. If you have specific goals in terms of the flow of business, you can do that in the charter or in local law in support of the charter, the administrative code. So if you go to the charter, you have essentially what you're doing is you're tailor designing the government for your purposes.
But when you said the executive would appoint the comptroller, I think it's this
Right.
body that
No, I
should.
didn't say I said I'm sorry I misspoke if I said that. I meant to say I created an elected comptroller
Elected
to
comptroller.
oversee the executive. And we did away with the treasurer. We distributed the functions between the chief finance officer on the executive side and the comptroller.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Dr. Benjamin, thank you for coming. We've had some discussions, so I do have 2 questions I'd like to pose.
I'm taking my jacket off, okay?
Yeah, go for it. The first is, it seems the different titles for administrator, manager, executive, they come down to a matter of functions within those. But what is to stop, let's say, our government body from adding additional functions or empowering our current
If you have a charter,
administrator?
you can.
We cannot, as we
You're
currently are.
governed by state law, except if you have a charter. Now, it gets a little, I get that back, right?
Yeah.
think you
He's just gonna go through the pockets.
My hearing aids are in there. It's 3 times. In your charter, you certainly can do it. Regarding state law, you can probably take actions under the constitutional home rule provisions that in some areas you can successfully take actions that preempt the state law. Okay, so let's put the charter over here. You have the highest level of discretion if you write a charter and you adopt it. You have some discretion. The trouble is when you try to preempt the state, most of the time the courts don't like the locality as much as they like the state. So when you go into a home rule fight, as I think your attorney will tell you, the state has two doctrines called the state purpose doctrine and the implied preemption doctrine that allow them to prevail in most differences. Sometimes they don't. Like when we litigated in Ulster County on filling vacancies, there was a rule for filling vacancies in the legislature, the way of doing it. And we wanted to do it a different way. Don't hold me to how it was different. And this was before we had a charter and we passed a local law and we succeeded in the Court of Appeals because of the home rule provision of the Constitution. So you might be able to do some of the things you want to do, but your best path to have maximum autonomy would be to have a charter.
So we do have flexibility now, we would have more flexibility.
I would recommend that the specific matter be identified and be researched by your attorney.
Okay, that's my first question. The second question is something that we've often discussed among this body.
That's called passing the buck.
Right, exactly. It's something that's unclear from when we've talked about it in government operations is actually moving on to a passage for a reapportionment or redistricting, and what type of threshold that would require among the county. Some say it has to be passed by 60% of the towns, villages, the city of Auburn, and the county. Others just say it has to be done by the city and the county.
That's a constitutional question. It's in Article 9, and a structural change requires multiple majorities.
Of even the towns, or?
All the towns outside the city collectively, and the city, for sure. I have to go look and see if it's a village. That's easy to look up, so we can pick right away. But there's definitely multiple majorities.
Just a simple majority within the totality of the towns and the city, in our case.
The city is separately.
Right, so in our case, it would be the totality of the towns, a simple majority in the city. Since we're
That's what it
in the
was for
city.
us to adopt the charter. The majority in the towns and the majority in the city. Are you allowed to ask a question?
I don't know.
You're in the audience.
I'm going to be persistent,
I
I
don't
probably
talk
can
to-
get
I don't-
away with it.
I don't talk to the audience.
She's on the Board of Elections.
It's not in
I'm
my
from the Board of
contract.
Elections. My question is about process. On a charter, you probably have a conflict of interest since you're a consultant, but do most of the counties go to a commission, an appointed commission to draw up a charter? Do they do a committee within the
There's a
legislature?
statutory provision on the process for adopting a county charter. It's in the municipal home.
So
rule.
is there a requirement that there be a public, a commission?
I
citizens
recall,
committee?
but it's easily researched, but I recall that.
It's spelled out in the Kuhn Department of State series on adopting county
And
charter.
there has to be a citizens committee that is.
I'll forward you the manual.
Right, charter commission.
But every place I know of has had a commission.
Right.
One last question.
Come on, Timmy, I'm trying to.
He's over his limit.
Were you,
Some of these guys want to watch the.
at St. Lawrence, were you a lax player or a football player?
Tennis player.
Tennis, okay. All right.
I got it. So, I was just wondering if you could expand on the 110% of, in order to divide towns.
There's no blackboard here.
Okay. So,
So take, what's your biggest town? Your,
I think that's my town.
Your range, I looked at your range, your population range, if you went to single member districts, and you only have one district in the county that would qualify right now.
Brutus, right? I think.
They will by numbers.
Yeah, so that means we couldn't divide any other town. So Brutus, in your opinion?
No, I didn't say that. I said that I was being non-responsive to the question. I'm trying to think of what the average population, if you divided 15 into the population of the county, there's 77,000 people, right, in the county?
It's like 6,000.
What?
It's around 6,000.
Around 6,000.
All right, so that if you had a town that had 6,600 people, you could divide it.
So that's probably gonna have to stay.
Now, I also said,
No, we went
that's
down.
under the state law.
That was the last
Now,
estimate.
if you had to do, if you had to meet federal requirements, one person, one vote requirements, voting rights requirements, which you don't have to because of the nature of your population, regional ethnic composition of the population, because you don't have to. So that if that required you to divide more towns, there's a hierarchy of values. You have to meet the federal requirements. You can't meet the federal requirements and conform to state law. You have to not conform to state law because the federal requirements are higher. So then the question comes, you have to examine the other aspects of your choice, right? You have to stick with 15 members because you meet the state law and the federal requirements. You change to 13 members, or 12 members, or 16 members. But
Are they playing tonight?
if the federal requirements can't be met while meeting the hierarchy of state laws, the state law has to give way. So that requires study, and a consideration of options.
And
Now, my approach would always be, try to conform to what the federal and state governments require. If I couldn't conform to it, and I had a good rationale for it, I'd go with what I had to do to meet the federal requirements and make that case. Am I being clear?
Well, that's a very effective non-answer.
It's not a non-answer. The answer is that you can't divide places under state law that are less than 10% above the average population. But you don't have to conform with state law if it would require you to violate federal law.
Mr. Petras, what he's saying is there's a hierarchy of law.
Yeah,
And so,
But, when you say it requires me to violate federal law, the question is, what are the premises?
And the federal law is right for challenge, right?
No, the federal law is not right for challenge, but the premise is, well, that I keep the same number of members. Maybe I could conform to all laws if I change the number of members.
Right.
So potentially we could go to like 7.
Well, you could look at that, right? I'm not saying willy-nilly violate state law. I'm saying if there's a compelling, we had to redistrict the town in Orange County. We were told that the state, we studied and found that state law delegated to the Board of Elections the redistricting task. The legislature, the town board aggregated to itself the redistricting and hired us. That was permitted because it was allowed, the contradiction of state law was allowed under home rule, another part of state law. Sometimes laws conflict, and you have to choose. Sometimes they conflict, you can find a path through it.
So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but potentially the best path forward in this scenario would be through the use of the charter and home rule.
The best path through is to find a way to conform to federal and state requirements. You can either do that with a charter or not.
he's saying that's separate from the charter conversation.
The redistricting.
Right. You're redistricting without a charter. With a charter, you have a whole different ballgame. You're doing a process that you created in the district.
One more question, I'm sorry. Have you said, or in your experience, have you seen a county redistrict and create a charter at the same time?
I've seen them create a charter anticipating redistricting, and they're doing redistricting immediately thereafter.
Just a point of clarification, we would not divide by 15, but we would divide by the number of towns and cities in the county, correct?
You would divide by whatever number of members you wanted.
No, I'm talking about in terms of the 10% rule. we represent multiple, most of us represent multiple towns.
Right.
The division of a town is based upon, as I understand the rule, is based upon the 10% above the population for each town, and not for each legislative district.
Right, that's right.
Okay, so the number would be closer to 3,000, 3,400, which many of the towns.
Right,
would
that's
do.
a mistake.
Yeah. But the other thing I would point out,
Does everybody understand the question? The law says you can't divide towns except if they have a population. You can only divide towns if they have a population 10% above the population of the largest.
So the other thing, point of clarification, it's my understanding, because we've done some preliminary kind of talk and work and investigation, it's my understanding the reason we came to this size was significantly the inability to come up with a size that did not divide towns, and kind of finally gave up with weighted voting, that applied all kinds of statistical models to try to find some combination where one person would vote. So that's been tried. Now maybe.
Well, you mean adhering to town boundaries without weighted voting?
Right.
And well, we did that in Ulster County by using multi-member districts.
Yeah, same idea.
Right. But at some point it stopped being possible, so we had to divide, we had to combine parts of some towns with the city of Kingston. So weighted voting is a way of keeping intact the boundaries. That's the main goal of weighted voting.
I know there's some people in
We're
here.
not causing confusion here rather than clarity. It sounds like-
No. There's
Clear as a bottle of wine.
there's a lot of people or some people who seem like they really want to go the charter way. My question is, I don't know if it was last week or whatever, we were given some paperwork on that. Yeah, you gave us something. When I was reading through that, because I actually did, in there it said one of the reasons for going to charter is population growth and all this. We're going the opposite way. And my one problem with charter, if you want to go down to like 7 members, like some people are saying, you're kind of limiting your pool of the people who are going to run for that, because that gives them more responsibility. So it almost becomes a full-time job, but it's a term-limited job.
Change the compensation.
But there's still a term-limited job.
The size of the county is a correlate of having a charter. It's not a reason for a charter.
And I think that,
Why do the bigger places go to a charter? They want to design their own government. They have big governments. They have big budgets. They want to have an executive an empowered and defined executive beyond what's possible in the state. So they go to a charter and they custom design that executive. And then they have to decide whether they want an elected or appointed executive. Right? And the arguments for elected and appointed were given. So if somebody's telling you that a cause to go to, if the size of the county is a cause, it's, I guess it makes people think about it, but I wouldn't call it.
I guess, like I said, my only fear
How big
is
your budget?
148.
So you need to think about somebody running a $148 million business.
Right.
By a committee. So that's the question.
Yeah.
When you're running a $50 million business, you can do it by committee, 40 million, 10 million. Some towns have a $2 million budget, and 70% is the highway fund. So maybe that's a part-time activity. But at some point, I guess it's the size of, I guess size is not a cause, but it's what makes people think about doing it.
But even if you raise the compensation, are you going to get the 35-year-old professional who would be really good to run for this position, but they don't have the time? Or are you going to get, and don't take this the wrong way, are you going to get all retired people, or I'll leave it at that. You know where I'm getting at. I mean, that's
The recruitment pool.
Remember, we're very rural.
Young people who want to be assemblymen, senators, and congressmen will seek positions in county government as a training ground. And a higher proportion of the members will be young people who want to rise in county government if there's a small number of members. I think that the barriers to public service aren't simply the level of compensation and the demands on time. I think there are a lot of young, energetic people who are being attracted into school boards where there's massive amounts of time and no compensation. Right. So I'm not sure that that's a compelling argument. That's my reaction.
We'll agree to disagree.
If I may just add, it's not,
County.
just to exemplify that it's not just about size, one of the counties that has both a county administrative form of government and a charter is Herkimer, which is another long, slender county without a huge population and much smaller budget than we have.
Actually, a very early charter out there.
Yeah, but an interesting charter. And I've reviewed all 5 of the charters that have an administrator or a manager, and I encourage you all to do that, and I can provide them to Sheila to send them out to you if you're interested, but
Yeah.
they're worth reading if this is a path you want to consider going down.
Yes.
If I could just offer something to what legislator Dennison said. I read the packet too, that was James Kuhn, Local Government Technical
Right, that's a
Series.
classic paper.
Right, and to his point, he says, how is the charter process started? And I quote, historically, population growth and rapid increases in the size of county budgets have been factors most responsible for stimulating interest in the development
I
of
think
local
that's fair.
county charters.
That's not quite saying it causes it.
What page is that?
I think that's fair. That's what I agree with that.
Okay.
That county's getting smaller.
It's a small point. For a social scientist, cause means
It says, but if
A
you read on
makes,
it,
A makes B happen, not A makes you think about B.
Right.
It's a small point, maybe an academic point.
also, if you read on, it says in perhaps less than $1 million. We're at 150.
That was 19 or
No, that was just,
1839.
that was, that's just a point.
This card is overwhelming.
You know, it says it's reasonable to question whether a government structure designed many decades ago to manage an operation providing few services and costing perhaps less than $1 million a year is suitable.
Right.
So, I mean, that's.
Yeah, that's
where
just
it kind of-
as a counterpoint.
Right.
Well, there's a big problem. in
So anything
state law
past
for local
1900 should be a
government.
charter, according to you.
State law is quite
Sure.
old for local government. It's a big problem.
Right.
They voted against the convention, Doctor, so we'll have to keep working under it for another 10.
Right. Anything past 1900 should be a charter, that's according to you.
Some people are wiggling around, they have to go to the bathroom when they gotta go home. I'll stay here as long as you wanna talk to me. Presuming that this motel will be open when I get there. They won't answer their phone. That's the most remarkable thing I've ever heard of. The hotel doesn't answer their phone.
Where is it?
Finger Lakes, what?
The figure-
Into the Finger Lakes?
Oh, my goodness, you made a mistake.
No.
Well, he obviously already made one mistake. He got a burger for dinner, for God's sakes.
You should have seen the place I didn't go to. The reviews of that place. Apparently have a certain collection of
Wildlife?
wild creatures in the. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for coming.
So, again, thank you, Dr. Benjamin. I think you gave us a lot to think about, and hopefully we can continue our work in this area. So, if there are no other questions, Dr. Benjamin has agreed to stick around and have individual discussions for a little bit, but I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move it.
Second.
All in favor? Opposed? Okay, thank you.